Hello, this is Susan Winkler, and I am welcoming you to our webinar today. I have the privilege of serving as the Chief Executive Officer of the Reagan-Udall Foundation for the FDA, and we are pleased to host this important discussion about recent draft guidance from FDA on the topic of real-world data and real-world evidence to support regulatory decision-making. If we go to the next slide, and we can advance even one further. I've got some housekeeping announcements before we get started. We have over 1,000 people registered for today's workshop, and we're so pleased that you could join us. For those who submitted questions as part of the registration process, we have your questions, and I will be raising as many of those as possible in the question and answer session of the webinar. I want to note, and many of you know this, but it's important to remind ourselves, the speakers today will not be discussing any specific regulatory actions or decisions, but they will be reviewing and engaging in active discussion about the guidance document. On the topic of discussion, we welcome your active engagement and invite you to submit questions or comments using the Zoom Q&A function. One note, after we finish the webinar today, the recording from today's meeting and the slides will be posted on the Foundation's website. We encourage you to also submit your comments and questions about the draft guidance to the Federal Register, and the docket number is on this slide and it's also in the meeting materials. If we go to the next slide, let's talk about the agenda for today. In just a moment, Dr. John Concato will provide some opening remarks, and then we will turn to Dr. Tala Fakhouri and Senior Counsel Stephanie Krause to present an overview of the draft guidance. Then we'll pull everybody together again at the end to go through some questions and answers with our team from the FDA. If we go to the next slide. There are some of you who have been joining us regularly, and so you know that we've completed 3 webinars on each of 3 guidance documents released by the FDA. Today, we're speaking about the 4th guidance document. As I mentioned, that there will be a recording of this webinar made available. The recordings of each of the 3 prior webinars are available on the FDA Foundation website at reaganudall.org. If we go to the next slide. It's our one more reminder for why we are here today. FDA recently released draft guidance on considerations for the use of real-world data and real-world evidence to support regulatory decision-making for drug and biological products. A link to that guidance is in the Zoom chat now, or is going to be posted there, and it's also on our website with the other event materials. I've got my copy right here as we prepare to hear from our speakers, and hope that you have one digitally or paper available. And again, FDA wants to hear comments and questions from the public, so please submit yours to the Zoom Q&A box or to the docket listed on the screen. And with that, I am going to step out of the way and we'll go to our next slide so that I can introduce our first speaker, Dr. John Concato. John serves as the Associate Director for Real-World Evidence Analytics in the Office of Medical Policy in the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research at FDA. Dr. Concato, it's great to have you back here for your 4th of 4 appearances in these webinars. I'm going to turn the microphone over to you.
Thanks very much, Susan, and hello to all joining this webinar, discussing, as you heard, what we informally actually described as our real-world data regulatory considerations guidance. As mentioned, I'm in the Office of Medical Policy at Cedar FDA, and I'll be providing opening remarks. But first, let me say that my comments may sound familiar for those who attended or afterwards viewed prior webinars in this real-world data, real-world evidence series. But I would say that's good in terms of the redundancy being intentional on our part. And I'll repeat what Susan just said about prior webinars being available on the Reagan-Udall website in case you missed them and are just hearing about it now. Next slide, please. Oh, and again, please advance one more. So let's start as of 2016 with passage of the 21st Century Cures Act, and subsequently FDA establishing a program to evaluate the use of real-world evidence for new indications of approved drugs or for post-approval requirements. Please recognize that FDA's substantial evidence standard remains unchanged, and that FDA has delivered on our real-world evidence commitments under PDUFA 6. FDA also published the framework in 2018, and today we're discussing the fourth of four guidances, again, as Susan mentioned, that were published before the end of 2021. Next slide, please. To just dig a little bit deeper on the 2018 framework that has been mentioned and the guidance we'll discuss, everything we're talking about today pertains to drugs and biologics, not to devices. Our Center for Devices and Radiologic Health has its own robust real-world evidence program. But we also just want to remind everyone that beyond the focus on guidance for today's webinar, CDER and CBER's real-world evidence program also includes internal agency processes, external stakeholder engagement, and numerous demonstration projects, which we're not here to talk about today. But hopefully everyone appreciates that the recent and current FDA portfolio of activities represents substantial progress in the era of real-world evidence. Next slide, please. So this slide shows the CDER 2021 guidance agenda with 4 real-world evidence-related draft guidance documents listed, including today's regulatory considerations, which is indicated by the full color arrow. We previously had webinars on data standards, EHR claims data, and registry data, as shown by the shaded arrows. What I also mentioned, although not shown here, is that the 2022 CDER guidance agenda has planned guidance on externally controlled trials and also on clinical practice data in randomized trials that similarly fall under the real-world data, real-world evidence umbrella. Next slide, please. So this snapshot of the title of the regulatory draft guidance, which is what we're here for today, of course, allows me to mention in general that when draft guidance is converted to final guidance, that represents FDA's current thinking on a topic. And to repeat and emphasize, reiterate what Susan mentioned, there's still time to send comments to the docket for this guidance. Today's webinar is wonderful and helpful, and we will not forget what is discussed and what is asked. But for the formality of going into the main pipeline of where we review and collate comments, please also feel free to take advantage of that docket that, as mentioned, is still open until early March. So with that, I'll say thank you very much, and I'll turn things over to Tala and Stephanie.
Good morning, and thank you for the introduction, John. For today's webinar, I'll be presenting an overview of the draft guidance that's titled Considerations for the Use of Real-World Data and Real-World Evidence to Support Regulatory Decision-Making for Drug and Biological Products. I'll be presenting this webinar with my colleague, Stephanie Krause, who's a Senior Regulatory Counsel in the Office of Regulatory Policy in CDER, the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research. Next slide, please. The one after. Thank you. The draft guidance focuses primarily on clinical study designs that are non-interventional, which are also referred to as observational studies. It discusses the applicability of FDA's investigational new drug application regulations under 21 Code of Federal Regulations, or CFR, Part 312, to various clinical designs or clinical study designs that utilize real-world data, or RWD. Specifically, this draft guidance provides regulatory considerations for non-interventional or observational studies involving real-world data. Next slide, please. But before we begin, and to ensure that we're all on the same page, this slide shows some definitions that are also included in the guidance. First, real-world data is data relating to patient health status and or the delivery of healthcare that is collected from a variety of sources. Real-world evidence, or RWE, is the clinical evidence about the usage and potential benefits or risks of a medical product derived from the analysis of real-world data. An interventional study, which is also referred to as a clinical trial, is a study in which participants who are either healthy volunteers or who are volunteers with the disease being studied are assigned to one or more interventions according to a study protocol to evaluate the effects of those interventions on subsequent health-related biomedical or behavioral outcomes. A non-interventional study, which is also referred to as an observational study, is a type of study in which patients receive the marketed drug of interest during routine medical practice and are not assigned to an intervention according to a protocol. Now that we've defined these terms, let's go over the draft guidance. Next slide, please. What I'm showing here on the slide is the table of contents for the guidance. And as you can see, it's divided into 4 sections. We begin with an introduction, provide a background. Then section 3 is the regulatory considerations that will be addressed. And we end with a glossary. As you can see, section 3 is divided into 2 sections. The first is related to the applicability of 21 CFR Part 312. And the second section, which is the regulatory considerations for non-interventional or observational studies, is further divided into 6 subsections that we will walk through today. Next slide, please. So in the introduction, we provide a definition of real-world data, or RWD, and real-world evidence, RWE, which was presented just a few moments ago, as well as other relevant information for this specific guidance. Next, please. In the background section, we define interventional and non-interventional study designs, also described briefly moments ago. We also provide several examples of these categories of study design, including randomized trials, observational cohort studies, and others. Next slide. Now, in section 3, which is the bulk of this guidance, we discuss the applicability of 21 CFR Part 312 to studies involving the use of real-world data. FDA recognizes the potential utility of using RWD in interventional studies. For example, some interventional studies will only use RWD to identify potential participants to enroll into a randomized controlled trial. Other interventional studies may use RWD to obtain a primary endpoint for a trial. However, we emphasize that if an interventional study meets the definition of a clinical investigation under 312.3, then it is subject to FDA regulations under Part 312. On the other hand, non-interventional studies or observational studies will typically analyze data reflecting the use of a marketed drug that is administered in routine medical practice and according to the medical provider's clinical judgment and based on patient characteristics rather than on assignment of a participant to a study arm according to a research protocol. Under these circumstances, a non-interventional study is not a clinical investigation as defined under CFR 312.3 and does not require an IND. And so the question is, what are the regulatory considerations for non-interventional studies that are not clinical investigations under 312.3? Next slide, please. And this is the discussion that we provide in section 3B, where we discuss the specific regulatory considerations for the use of RWD in non-interventional study designs. For today's presentation, I'll be first providing an overview that discusses several general issues, and then I'll provide some discussion around issues related to transparency in data collection and analysis before I hand it over to my colleague, Stephanie Krause, who will walk us through issues related to data access, safety reporting, study monitoring, and we'll end with other responsibilities for the sponsors. Next slide, please. Let's start with the overview. Next. Okay. Now, regardless of a study's interventional or non-interventional design, the evidence submitted by a sponsor in a marketed application to support the safety and or effectiveness of a drug must satisfy the applicable legal standards of the application to be approved or licensed. We recognize that there are two general types of non-interventional studies: those that involve only the analysis of data reflecting the use of a marketed drug in routine medical practice. But then there are these non-interventional studies that include ancillary additional protocol specified activities or procedures, like the collection of questionnaires, additional laboratory tests, and imaging studies. All of this information is collected to help address the question or questions of interest in these studies. FDA does not recognize these studies to be clinical investigations under 21 CFR Part 312, and again, an IND is not required. Nonetheless, the protection of human subjects under these circumstances is critical, and sponsors must ensure the applicable requirements per FDA regulations under 21 CFR Part 50 as it relates to the protection of human subjects, and 56 as it relates to institutional review boards. Next, please. The final bullet that we include in the overview section is this emphasis that when appropriate, sponsors should really consult with experts who consider data privacy issues to provide input on the protocol during the study design phase for a non-interventional or an observational study, as these experts may help identify and address data privacy and data security concerns raised when accessing healthcare data. Next. In section B2, we address regulatory considerations related to transparency in data collection and analysis. Next slide, please. We begin with an emphasis on the importance of early engagement. So sponsors should engage with the FDA in the early stages of designing a non-interventional study intended to support a marketing application. For example, a sponsor can request a Type C meeting with the appropriate review division to discuss the agency's expectations for the design and for the conduct of their observational study. Sponsors should provide draft versions of their proposed protocols and statistical analysis plan, which I will refer to as an SAP, for agency review and comment prior to finalizing these documents and before conducting the study analyses. As it relates to the study protocol and the SAP, for FDA to adequately assess the results of a non-interventional study supporting marketing application, the agency must be confident that particular data sources and databases were not selected or that specific analyses were not conducted to favor a certain conclusion. Therefore, the protocol and the SAP should be finalized prior to conducting the pre-specified analyses listed in the protocol and the SAP. The sponsors should provide evidence that the protocol and SAP were finalized prior to reviewing outcome data and before performing the pre-specified analyses. In addition, and importantly, that any revisions to the protocol should be date stamped and the rationale for each change should be provided. Next, please. As it relates to data source selection, the FDA recognizes that access to an evaluation of different relevant data sources or databases are important steps in the design of a study and in evaluating a study's feasibility. The evaluations of data sources and databases for study design or for feasibility purposes generally serves as a first step to first learn about the suitability of the data source or the database to address the question of interest, and two, to estimate the statistical precision of a potential study without evaluating outcomes for treatment arms. For these evaluations, the sponsors should describe in the study protocol all the data sources that were accessed when designing the study, as well as the results from feasibility evaluations or exploratory analyses of those data sources. And the sponsor should provide a justification for selecting or excluding relevant data sources from the study. FDA recommends that sponsors generate audit trails in their data sets that can track access and track analyses that were performed on these relevant data sources. Next, please. For documentation, sponsors should document all analyses performed on the data during the study design phase, including the feasibility evaluations and exploratory analyses that we just described. Sponsors should also demonstrate that the choice of the final analytic data set and the conduct of the final analyses align with the research question of interest and do not favor particular study findings. As for inclusion and exclusion criteria, sponsors should describe patient characteristics of the source population, which we define as the population from which the study population is drawn, and the study population, which is the population for which analyses are conducted, and then note any differences between the source population and the study population. Note these differences that may impact the final study findings. Next, please. Finally, and in the transparency section, we discussed study registration. And to ensure transparency regarding the study design, sponsors should post their study protocols on a publicly available website. We include examples, clinicaltrials.gov, or the webpage for the European Network of Centers for Pharmacoepidemiology and Pharmacovigilance for post-authorization studies. Next slide, please. I will now hand it over to my colleague, Stephanie Kraus, to walk us through the next several steps.
Thanks so much, Tala, and good morning, everyone. In this section, we talk about the importance of providing FDA with the data necessary to evaluate a non-interventional study. Next slide, please. In the early stages of study design, sponsors should discuss with the relevant review division the expectations regarding access to real-world data. Sponsors must ensure that they're able to submit patient-level data for any real-world data that have been analyzed as part of the clinical study included in a marketing application when required under applicable FDA regulations. FDA recognizes that data ownership of real-world data sources used in non-interventional studies can be different from data sources traditionally collected in interventional studies. So if certain real-world data are owned and controlled by third parties, sponsors should have agreements in place to ensure that relevant patient-level data can be provided to FDA and source data necessary to verify the real-world data are available for inspection. Next slide, please. Real-world data submitted to the agency should also include the associated programming codes and algorithms, and those should be well annotated and complete to allow FDA to replicate the study analysis. Next slide, please. This section discusses when study monitoring should be conducted and may look like for non-interventional studies. Next slide, please. For non-interventional studies, appropriate monitoring will likely differ based on the type of non-interventional study design. If there are no additional ancillary activities, study monitoring may be focused on maintaining the reliability of the real-world data and data integrity, beginning with extraction of the data from its origin through data curation and transformation and reporting of results. However, if there are additional protocol-specified activities and procedures, study monitoring should also ensure that applicable human subject protections are met and data integrity is maintained. For all studies, FDA encourages a risk-based quality management approach to study oversight, focusing on preventing or mitigating important and likely risks to study quality and on processes critical to human subject protection. Let's go to the next slide, please. This guidance also discusses considerations for safety reporting for non-interventional studies. Next slide, please. As with any marketed drug, sponsors should submit relevant adverse events in accordance with applicable post-marketing safety reporting regulations. But we know that sponsors will often only use a subset of a larger real-world data set to conduct analyses to support labeling changes. In those cases, FDA doesn't expect the sponsor to search the entire database regarding all uses of the product for adverse events that would meet the reporting requirements under FDA's regulations. But if a sponsor identifies adverse events that are subject to post-marketing reporting requirements during the course of conducting a non-interventional study, such events must be reported. Next slide, please. This section includes recommendations for sponsors regarding the design, conduct, and oversight of these non-interventional studies. Let's go to the next slide, please. We'll start with 21 CFR Part 11. Electronic systems used by the sponsor to manage data and to produce required records must comply with 21 CFR Part 11. The guidance also mentions some other sponsor responsibilities. Specifically, sponsors should take responsibility for all activities related to the design, conduct, and oversight of the studies, including selecting researchers qualified by training and experience and confirming that researchers have the appropriate skills and information, ensuring that the study is conducted in accordance with the final protocol and statistical analysis plan and documenting any deviations, maintaining and retaining adequate study records, ensuring that FDA can access and verify relevant records, for example, source records, and ensuring appropriate monitoring of the study, including selecting a monitor qualified by training and experience for studies requiring additional data collection. Next slide, please. To understand the landscape of the study, FDA expects to review information regarding the researchers involved in the study. As such, FDA recommends that sponsors should retain and make available upon request a log of any researchers who have significant involvement in the design or study of the design of the study. The log should confirm that the researcher's name and affiliations, description of roles or activities performed, qualifications regarding education, training, and experience. Regarding third parties, if the sponsors engage third parties to perform study-related tasks, the sponsor should document the roles and responsibility of the organizations performing the tasks. However, sponsors remain responsible for all study-related activities unless the sponsor has transferred its responsibility to a contract research organization. Next slide, please. And now I will pass this back to Tala.
Thank you, Stephanie. As noted in the opening page of the guidance, that as also emphasized by Susan, by John, we really encourage you to submit your comments or questions to the draft guidance, to the docket. On the slide and also in the guidance, we provide instructions on how to submit electronic submissions versus written submissions, and the address is also listed here. Thank you again, and we look forward to your comments here. Next slide, please. I just wanted to end by basically acknowledging that this draft guidance involved several offices within CDER, including the Office of Medical Policy, the Office of New Drugs, Regulatory Policy, Strategic Programs, the Office of Surveillance and Epidemiology, and the Office of Translational Science. And it was also in collaboration with colleagues in other centers within FDA, including CBER, the Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research, FDA's Oncology Center of Excellence, and CDRH, the Center for Devices and Radiological Health. With that, next slide, I'd like to thank everyone for your attendance, and I'll turn it back to Susan and John. We can begin our Q&A.
That's great. Thank you so much to both Dr. Fakhouri and Senior Counsel Kraus for walking us through the guidance. I was struck as you went through the structure that I'm sure no one would ever think of, of FDA regulation as choose your own regulatory path, but the guidance makes clear that that is not the situation here, but also clarifies in what regulatory structure the real world data, real world evidence operates, what decisions should be made when, the roles of the sponsors, documentation, and other details that are just really helpful as we think about the greater application of real world data and real world evidence. So thank you for walking us through that. As you noted, now it's time for our panel discussion. So we're
Susan,
going to be,
Susan,
yes,
sorry to
please.
interrupt, but can I just emphasize a point you made
Absolutely.
and link it to one of the slides that Tala Fakuri had mentioned? If it wasn't evident during the presentation, and I think it was clearly presented, thank you, Tala. If a study includes an interventional arm, then it is under 312. So to add to that, if someone is doing an externally controlled trial and the treatment arm by definition is an intervention, and the external control arm happens to be, say, from a prior clinical trial, that obviously would be under 312. But if it's not apparent, if another sponsor is doing an externally controlled trial, where the interventional arm, of course, by definition, comes from a trial, and the external control arm comes from a real world data source, let's say a medical record review, that is still under 312. So again, this is just emphasizing the basics, but I think it's fair to say we tip our hat, we acknowledge how well our regulations have held up over time, but it's not our predecessors' fault, quote unquote, for not realizing that we'd be where we are now, courtesy of big data, real world data, real world evidence, where we are trying to say, well, how do these regulations apply to a situation that just was not envisioned years ago? So again, to emphasize the basics, I just wanted to make that point, but let's move on to the Q&A. And thank you, Susan, sorry for interjecting.
No, that was a really helpful reminder that there's the broad statutory structure, which can only address so many things. And then we have more detail in the regulation. And then to help us adapt to the continually changing regulatory environment and the environment in which we operate, guidance documents help us navigate and understand how to work through that and apply the vast power in the right way. So really helpful for that. With that, we have a number of questions from folks that have been submitted to us, and I want to make sure that we apply the time to that. So thank you to each of you for coming back to the panel to help us walk through those questions. So the first one, I think it's going to be one that's going to go to you, Stephanie. So this question is specifically, if an IND is not required for a non-interventional study, where should sponsors submit their protocols and meeting requests to engage the agency during the study design phase? So they know what path they're going down, but where do they submit that information?
Sure. Thanks, Susan. That's a really important question. And if anyone still uses a pen, this is time to write this down, or otherwise type on whatever gadget you have. So this is for administrative purposes only. Sponsors should submit the study documents and other related documents to an existing IND for the product. But if there is no existing IND for the product, say it was withdrawn or terminated, then sponsors should open a pre-investigational new drug application and put the documents there, but not open a new IND. And again, this is for administrative purposes only.
Really helpful, and always good to have that cue to say, here's a good thing to note and say where you want to put that down. So if just for administrative purposes, that's where the information goes, understood. So our next question, well, this continues down the line of the non-interventional study design. For non-interventional study designs that use electronic health records that are created for non-research purposes, do those source data need to be Part 11 compliant? Tala, I think I see your name when I think Part 11 compliance. Does this one go to you?
Sure. Great question. Thank you. So just to reiterate what you said, the FDA recognizes that data available in EHRs are generated during routine clinical care for non-research purposes and are generally under the control of a healthcare provider and the institutions in which the EHRs are collected. This was actually described in our guidance to industry that was titled Electronic Source Data in Clinical Investigations, that FDA does not intend to assess the compliance of the EHR system with Part 11. However, sponsors must demonstrate to the FDA that adequate controls are in place to ensure the confidence in the reliability of the source data, the quality of the source data, and the integrity of the EHR. I hope that answers your question.
It does. So if I can paraphrase, recognizing that the data was not created for research purposes, FDA is not going to say, do the EHR systems comply with research requirements?
Right.
But you do need, the sponsors need to have those controls in place so that you can be confident in the reliability and the quality and integrity of the data.
Correct.
Okay.
Yes.
That we can go with, because I can't imagine the revision we'd have to do to electronic health records everywhere. But this allows us to still get that benefit without changing the purpose for which the electronic health record is generated. So now this next question, this takes us to the publication of related guidance documents. So picks up, Tala, a bit on what you just mentioned in referring to a related guidance document. But thinking about this guidance today, it does not address questions regarding non-interventional study design and conduct. So does FDA plan to issue policy regarding the design and conduct of non-interventional studies? I think, John, these other guidance questions typically go to you. Are you going to pick this one up?
Sure, I will. Thanks, Susan. Well, I first want to take the opportunity to emphasize that when planning and conducting any non-interventional study, sponsors should mainly ensure, first and foremost, that the data are fit for purpose. I know we've talked about exactly what fit for purpose means in prior webinars and in other contexts, but for our current purposes, let's just emphasize that we've published several draft guidances on real-world data sources, such as EHR claims, specifically registry data, and data standards. But since literally it was the last time we had a webinar, we also can say publicly that we are working on additional guidances, including one on the considerations for the design of externally controlled trials, as well as trials in clinical practice settings. Those titles, the official titles, are visible on our 2022 guidance agenda, which was released in the past several weeks. But I just really want to say that having the right data, I don't want to say it's more important, but it's often more of a challenge than issues with study design per se. But please stay tuned would be the informal way of saying that, yes, there is more guidance on the way to address the question of study design proper. Thank you.
Great. We will all stay tuned and kind of see how all of these fit together in providing a helpful structure for regulated industry.
Could I follow up real quick? Yeah, no, just if I mentioned this last time on the webinar, so be it, but I know I did mention it somewhere in a public forum, but we were aware of the choice between, and if I say tension, the healthy tension between having multiple guidances or having one overall Uber guidance. And clearly to have all of the details in one guidance, it would have been incredibly long, incredibly complex, but no choice is perfect. It's not that either way is right or wrong inherently. So going this route, we do appreciate that there are different guidances, but the logic behind our approach should be evident by now, that we have a sort of a category for data, a category for design, and what we're talking about today really might be viewed as overarching to sort of give a view of that landscape from up above, to say that how do these different types of studies, which encompass their respective data sources, organize themselves. But at the end of the day, when we do get comments on each of these guidances, we not only look within each guidance, but we look across the guidances, so that as we move forward, we'll be very clear to be connecting the dots and making this as clear as possible for our stakeholders. Thank you.
I'm struck, John, that the breaking it out into pieces approach gives us guidance documents that are in that 10 to 15 page range versus one that's about 80 pages. And that's for sure true with my children and me as a learner. I'd rather go through the 10 page and learn and then see how everything fits together than try to slog through the entire thing. And I can only imagine, reflecting on my time at the agency, that trying to write a really long one and work it through the system, that perhaps this more compartmentalized approach yields guidance documents sooner, and then the ability to integrate them that also allows some flexibility in advancements in those guidance documents as we continue to have changes in the environment.
Exactly. Thank you.
Great. So now a more specific question about the interaction between real world data sources and the sponsors. So this question is, where real world data sources are owned and controlled by third parties, what happens if sponsors cannot obtain access to the data? So I guess you have data here and the sponsors want to use it, but they can't get specific access. I will open that up. Who wants to unmute and jump on that one? Oh, Stephanie, I see you're unmuted.
Yes, I'll take that one. This is a really important question. If we have a sponsor that comes to us and says, here's my non-interventional study that's going to support my marketing application, but I have no data, that's just not going to work. The regulatory requirements are the same whether you have an interventional or non-interventional study. And one of the things that we have emphasized from the outset in our framework, in our other webinars, in our guidance documents, and John just mentioned this before, is that a data source must be fit for purpose. And part of determining whether a data source is fit for purpose is ensuring that FDA can actually see the data and that source records are available for inspection. Absent that, it's hard to argue that the data source is fit for purpose. Now, if there are legitimate reasons why a third party might have to bypass the sponsor, say for some privacy information concerns, we do have avenues for the third party to submit the data sets to FDA. The third party can open a research pre-IND, or they can open a drug master file type 5 and put the data sets in there, and then provide the sponsor with a right of reference. So there are regulatory mechanisms to do this, and it's very important that we have the data.
Really helpful, Stephanie, both in clarifying you need access to the data, but there are mechanisms other than sponsor must get it directly, but through that master file or having the third party submit a research IND. John, do you want to add to that?
No, I think Stephanie said it very nicely. Again, we're coming up with mechanisms or just identifying where within the regulations we can accommodate what needs to get done. And ultimately, things are handled on a case-by-case basis, but we trust that our stakeholders appreciate what Stephanie Cross just said, really provides the big picture path forward so that we will look forward to working with sponsors to make this work.
That makes a lot of sense, and great to have the solution available as well. Now, I will say, John, you and I have done a couple of these webinars now, and there's almost always somebody who throws in this really practical question, and it's come up again. We have a question again that says, can you speak to examples of successful or unsuccessful real-world evidence use cases? So we've been speaking kind of hypothetically and about the structure and how you should approach this. Can you walk us through an example where we've had successful or unsuccessful use?
Okay, well, in the previous question, I think I didn't recall what I said where and when. In this case, I do recall that it was the prior webinar last month on registry data where we did bring up an example. So I'm going to use that same example. It's fairly recent. It's also very, I think, hopefully clearly understood. At that time, we discussed the drug tacrolimus or Prograf as a successful example, to answer the question directly, Susan. But in brief, to assess the effectiveness of that drug to prevent organ rejection or death after lung transplantation in particular. That was a new indication that was being sought, a non-interventional, AKA observational study, which again is the connection to why it's relevant to talk about this today. That study identified outcomes of patients using registry data. It's happens to be a Health and Human Services supported registry that's been for many decades. The data are fit for use, have been shown to be fit for use for other research questions. We did not take that for granted, but that was helpful in our assessment of whether the data were fit for use here. When that process was done in the review, those results were then compared to the outcome of historical control patients. That's the study design under the real world evidence umbrella. So when all was said and done, when the review was completed and when all the data were thoroughly analyzed, the submission, the application was approved. And we can say based on real world data, real world evidence. And that represents the first time that the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research at FDA has considered a non-interventional, AKA observational study to be adequate and well controlled in meeting our substantial evidence standard under the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. So without getting too jargony, and I came to FDA a couple of years ago, I didn't memorize this stuff, but I used to note when others said it, sorry folks, but 21 CFR 314.126, which has to do with adequate and well controlled, is what this was all about. So it might be more, it's certainly very impactful in general, Susan, and to the audience, but I think internal to FDA, this is a notable example in that if there was any doubt that FDA was willing to, and CDER and CBER in particular, were willing to consider real world data, real world evidence, I think we can be comfortable in saying we honored our obligation to protect the public health by maintaining our standards. And yet at the same time, we showed that when a submission is satisfactory, we are very comfortable with making the decision to approve. Now, on the flip side, and I don't want to take too much time with this one question, but submissions that contain RWD, RWE that do not measure up, do not meet applicable legal and regulatory standards, that can be lacking for a variety of reasons. And obviously, I won't talk about any one of them in particular in terms of details of specific cases. But I will say, and this is a generalization with all the caveats, that the issues, and I think Stephanie, you said this as well, right? It's very often a lack of fit for use data, and sometimes perhaps inadequate study design, but it's not as if there are hidden secrets to a special study design that's going to get one an approval. It's really, if you don't mind me using the phrase, bread and butter, good design practice, good epidemiologic practice, if you will. But let me stop there because we still have, I'm sure, many questions that we want to get through. Thank you.
So it's, I'll note, always encouraging to say, here's where we've seen it's been used, and then recognize it's used when it's good and structured well. So let me ask a question. It's going to take us a little bit in a different direction. And this one, I think, Tala, this will be one for you. Are there different considerations for a submission involving real-world data, real-world evidence, when they're providing context or confirmation as opposed to being the primary basis for approval? So do you think about that differently?
Right. So this is actually an important question and kind of ties with how John ended his last answer. So this guidance that we're focusing on today, you could think about it as, it recommends good practices for non-interventional observational studies in general. Good practices in general. The guidance really emphasizes, and I tried to do that in the slides, the importance of early engagement. So come to the FDA with any plans to conduct a non-interventional observational study, and have these discussions about the planned role for the non-interventional study in the development program for a specific drug or a biologic. These early types of engagements with the FDA can help clarify the FDA's expectations about the design, about the conduct of the non-interventional or observational study, And we could also have discussions around access to RWD data. So again, in short, no, this guidance is a recommendation for good practices for non-interventional studies overall and in general.
And one of those, yeah, go ahead, Stephanie.
I just wanted to add to what Talat said, that during those conversations, it's really important that the sponsor be clear about the role that evidence is going to play. It's not always clear in a submission what the real world evidence is actually being used for, and what regulatory requirement it is fulfilling or supporting. So it would be helpful if there were greater clarity around that in the submission.
And I'm sorry, Susan, all three of us are going to weigh in. My FDA colleagues are tired of hearing me saying this perhaps, but I'll also put out a general plea to be very clear with the use of RWD and RWE in general and one versus the other. We have found, and it's all part of the socialization process, but the terms are often used ambiguously, inconsistently, and sometimes incorrectly. And we could sort through that, but sometimes paying attention to common quote unquote basic aspects helps a lot. But I'm echoing what Stephanie said, who is echoing what Tala said. So thank you.
That's a piece we probably can't hear often enough about early engagement and clarity. So we'll underscore both of those again. Let's move to another question though. This one looks at monitoring frequency. So what monitoring frequency is typically seen in non-interventional studies using real world data collection? Tala, do you want that one?
Yeah, I can take
Great.
that. So Stephanie actually discussed that in the guidance, and it's nicely described also in the guidance, that really the frequency of study monitoring will be a case-specific determination depending on the design of the study. So for non-interventional or observational studies that, there are no additional ancillary protocols, you're not collecting additional information, lab tests or questionnaires, et cetera, study monitoring will be focused on maintaining the reliability of the RWD and on data integrity. But if a non-interventional study is collecting additional ancillary activities, then there will be additional considerations for monitoring, right? And that will include ensuring applicable human subject protection. As Stephanie mentioned, and as also included in the guidance, the FDA encourages a risk-based quality management approach to study monitoring, including a focus on preventing important risks to human subjects and to the quality of the study. So it depends on whether you're collecting additional information or not, and the frequency will be a case-specific determination.
So kind of that level of effort.
Yeah.
Calibrated level of effort. Okay. This then, the next one speaks a bit to that, having a study that's observational in design, and then there's an added piece to it. So here specifically, the question asks, how do studies that are observational in design, but also have dedicated collection of specific lab samples, how would that affect the regulatory requirements? So I think working from a observational, but you're going to do something extra. Stephanie, I see you.
I can jump in on that one. Our guidance actually discusses this specifically. So if you're going to have an observational study with additional data collection, in addition to the monitoring issues, even though an IND isn't required under those circumstances, FDA's human subject regulations, 21 CFR Part 50 informed consent and Part 56 IRB review absolutely do apply. And we underscore the importance of patient protection and patient safety under those circumstances.
So be cognizant of what else applies when you have an observational and.
Correct.
Is that, okay.
But another
especially
way to put
when it comes to human subjects, yes.
Yeah.
Stephanie, would you agree if the clinical side, so to speak, is taking care of things and is responding? It's not as if we're turning a blind eye, right? But we're not going to be looking over the shoulder of hospital systems that have their own policies and practices and regulations to adhere to in terms of labs being done and attributable to the right patient, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, that's sort of one way to sort of put this particular question and conversation in context. Is that fair?
Sure, although we have our specific regulations that govern informed consent for the purposes of research, and those have certain criteria of what must be in the informed consent. So we encourage everybody to look at our guidances and regulations on ensuring compliance.
All right, if I misspoke, I didn't mean to suggest that a lab drawn for research purposes wasn't our concern. Rather, if part of the real world data set is labs that were done not for research purposes, that I'm just trying to draw the distinction between what we are looking at and what we're not looking at. But I think we're okay. Thank you, Stephanie.
So I am watching and our time is ticking away, but I think we can fit in two last quick questions. And then we'll close us out because our 60 minutes is slipping away. So this one, what statistical tests does the FDA want to see used with observational analyses?
I could take this one, Susan.
Okay.
Yeah. Again, the guidance we're talking about today isn't about study design, and it's certainly not statistical analysis. And we recognize that there is going to be some overlap. Obviously, in our data guidance, as we've talked, the word design can be found with a search, but it's not going into detail. But I think in general, and this is true on the clinical trial side of the house, right? With all of our guidances on trials, no single statistical or analytic method is suitable for all interventional studies. And the same thing is true here. No single statistical or analytic method is going to be the right tool for the job for all non-interventional studies. So it's not as if we have an answer and we're not sharing it. Instead, good practice, again, analyses should be aligned with the study design. And most importantly, and as others have said, any particular approach that's being planned should be discussed with the appropriate review division. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Have that conversation and land on the right one. It won't be declared in guidance. Okay, let's do one last question. Oh, and actually this is a really good last question. What else is FDA doing to help stakeholders better understand how real-world evidence can support regulatory submissions? This seems like a broader level question, and so, John, you get those.
Thanks, Susan, and thanks for the question. Again, I think the topic was shown in the overview slides, where I tried to convey the fact that FDA has an active and ongoing program involving real-world data, real-world evidence that includes internal agency processes. By that I mean how we communicate in terms of when submissions come in, external stakeholder engagement, largely via our real-world evidence subcommittee. Demonstration projects, I think we have more than, well, I know we have slightly over 20 demonstration projects in categories of improving real-world data, better understanding or advancing real-world study designs, and also sort of tools, although hopefully COVID will wane, the My Studies app comes to mind, among other examples. And last but not least, guidance development. So, but what I guess I could add and looking forward to, we could point to, it's officially titled the quote, Advancing Real World Evidence Program, close quote, that could potentially start in October of this year if Congress reauthorizes the Prescription Drug User Fee Act. I think we're running out of time, but basically the PDUFA 7 commitment letter was released in August. It's publicly available. It would do three things. First, identify approaches for generating real-world evidence that can meet regulatory requirements. Second, develop processes that promote consistent decision-making and shared learning about real-world evidence. And then third, promote awareness of characteristics of RWE, that successful RWE, by allowing FDA to discuss study designs that worked in a public forum. So again, we need to wait to hear from Congress, but if all goes well, we certainly are gearing up to be ready to implement that program for FY 2023, that is October of this current calendar year. Thanks, Susan.
One of many, many, many reasons that it is important for the latest PDUFA package to be reauthorized before September 30th. We will add that to the list. All right, I'm going to say thank you so much to Stephanie, to Tala, to John. Really helpful presentation and discussion and walking through the questions. So thank you for joining us today. And I am going to close this out. If we could go to, we've got one slide to toss up and say, please Submit your comments and questions about the draft guidance to the document and docket rather. Submit your documents to the docket. And we have more information on the event on our foundation website. If we go to our last slide, it's time for me to say thank you to all of our speakers for participating today, and a special thank you to our FDA Planning Committee members. Thank you to everyone in the audience for attending, and most importantly for submitting questions for the speakers. Those were so helpful in helping us yield a rich discussion today. With that, thank you so much for joining us. Take care and enjoy the rest of your Friday.